So welcome to the SACNAS webinar on how to give effective online presentation. My name is Kateryna, and as a SACNAS Student Programs Manager, I oversee the Research Presentations program. I'm very glad to have you all here today. Thank you for joining. In this webinar, 3 professionals from academia will share best practices on presenting your science virtually, whether it is for your class, college symposiums, or virtual conferences. So for our first-time attendees, welcome to SACNAS. We are an inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM, where the field, including leadership positions, reflects demographics of our population. As the nation's largest multicultural, multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization in the country, SACNAS creates space where all members, partners, and staff feel they belong and can embrace their intersectional identity. If you are not yet, I invite you to join SACNAS membership. It will give you access to a welcoming community of like-minded students and professionals from all STEM disciplines, including the opportunity to connect to one of our national chapters, eligibility to apply for programs specifically for each stage of your education or career, exclusive opportunities from our partners, such as jobs, internships, and so much more. And of course, opportunity to raise your voice for true diversity and inclusion in STEM. To become a member, you can sign up for free by visiting membership.sacnas.org. So before I introduce our panel today, I want to mention a few things. Please submit your questions via chat feature throughout the webinar, and in the second portion we will open it up for Q&A discussion, and we will address your questions. Please remember to be always polite and respectful to others with your comments, and if we don't get to some of your questions today, stay until the end of this webinar and I will tell you more how to continue the conversation in our online community. So now, let me introduce our speakers today. Mariano Banuelos is an assistant professor of mathematics at California State University, Fresno. He's a first-generation Chicano from the small agriculture town of Delano, California. His research interest includes mathematical biology, optimization, statistical models for genome evolution, and data science. He has been a SACNAS member since 2015, where he presented his work and received an award as a graduate oral presenter. Mario is passionate about undergraduate research and increasing representation in STEM. When he is not thinking of mathematics, Mario enjoys drawing, graphic design, and going to local sporting events. Ariana Eily is postdoctoral associate with Duke Initiative for Science and Society, focusing on science communication, training, and coaching. She's interested in the intersection between art and science, or STEAM. In a developing ways, science can be more deeply connected to society. Ariana grew up in Chulota, Florida, and has a strong passion for making science more inclusive and accessible to everyone. Her hobbies include baking, hiking with her dog, gardening, yoga, working out, sports, and practicing mindfulness. Our last speaker for today is Evan Reynolds. He's an assistant professor of chemistry at Campbell University. Evan was born and raised in Tallahassee, Florida. Evan is passionate about science education and serving as a mentor to young scientists. Being of Latin American descent, Evan is also an advocate for increasing diversity in science, and has been a member of SACNAS since 2016 when he became involved in UNC's SACNAS chapter. In his free time, Evan enjoys spending time with his wife, Rebecca, and his 8-month-old daughter, Madeline, volunteering at his church, and being outdoors, especially while swimming, biking, or running. So now I will give an opportunity for speakers to share their experience and provide you with the best practices.
All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for the nice introduction, Kateryna. So now that we're talking about virtual presentations, I think it's important to know that there are different kinds of virtual presentations. So there are live virtual presentations and recorded virtual presentations. And then even in that, you could have oral presentations or poster presentations. So I've had some experience with assigning, grading, and judging all of those. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you get a little bit more insight on how to prepare your presentation, whether it's oral or a poster. So when we're talking about presenting virtually, there's going to be a lot of pros and a lot of cons to doing this. One of the pros is that you can practice before recording if it's a recorded session. And if you mess up, you can re-record, right? So you have that opportunity to do that. Another thing is that you don't have to worry as much about making eye contact if it's recorded with your audience, and you can have notes up if you need to refer to something. Some of the cons is it's difficult to keep the audience engaged as you would in a live presentation. And you also lose the benefit of gauging the audience interest. Like, for example, right now, I'm pretending somebody's there, but I can only see the 3 other people here and in the webinar. So some general advice for presenting at a virtual conference, again, whether it's recorded or live, is some advice that I would give regardless if it was live or not. And that's seek feedback from your mentors, your peers, your research advisors for your presentation. I can't stress that enough. And another thing is make sure you follow the guidelines. So if there's a guideline for a recorded session or live, if it's 5 to 7 minutes presentation, make sure you follow that because the longer the presentation or the shorter the presentation, that might affect you if you're getting judged, for example. Another important thing is to relax and to do things that help you relax before you present. And it's okay if you mess up, because that's going to be a part of it. And it's okay if you have technical difficulties, because that's also going to be a part of it in this new world. Another aspect is that since you don't have that live audience, you might want to have a test audience. So that could be other people. It could be family, it could be friends, it could be other peers. And just some other advice is dress professionally, and maybe like from the shoulders up for your video is sufficient. We don't have to see your whole body for the presentation. So that's just some overall advice I have. And this advice is from some of the questions that were submitted for this webinar in specific. So another question that was brought up was advice for theoretical sciences. So I've actually had the opportunity to judge one such presentation, and using visualizations to motivate the theoretical problem you're working on is very helpful, especially at the beginning, so that by the time you tell your story, there is some maybe visualization that the audience can relate that to you. So one effective way to tell if people understood what you're talking about is if you ask them to summarize it after, right? Can they give you the main points after listening to your presentation? Some tips for not speaking fast is to include purposeful pauses to practice your timing. That's something that you have a lot of power over now if it's recorded or live. And along with that, when you're creating your slideshow, you want to communicate your results or your methodology in, I would say, pictures, because it's easier to tell that story with pictures rather than seeing a lot of text, right? So even in if it wasn't a virtual presentation, a lot of text is also distracting. So because people are reading that instead of listening to the story you're trying to tell. So be mindful of that. A lot of people have Zoom burnout. So then think about how do you effectively present your story in visual ways. So Evan's going to talk a little bit more about specific presentation tips.
Sorry, make sure I unmute myself there. It's a good thing to make sure that you do before you give your virtual presentation. Another thing, you can always acknowledge technical difficulties while you're presenting. It's a little awkward, but helps break the ice maybe in some cases. But yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to give an elevator pitch, which is an important skill to have even if you're giving a live presentation, not only just in a virtual setting, but if you're in a live in-person conference. And I've pulled together some tips in a document that I think is going to be shared with you all through the chat. So you can look over the tips that I'm going to be talking about right now. But the first thing to do is just define what an elevator pitch is. So it would be a short synopsis of your research that you can do in a short period of time, typically maybe around 30 seconds to 2 minutes, or in other words, the time that it takes to ride an elevator. And you want to summarize the main points of your research, its significance, and how it fits in with the broader field or your area of interest. So there's essentially 5 major elements to this elevator pitch. I think the most important thing to start with is to introduce yourself. So at the beginning of your presentation, make sure you say who you are, maybe a little bit of background information about yourself, like where you go to school or what you're studying, and then introduce the topic of your research. So you can start with the broader area that you're interested in, and then narrow down on the specific question that you're addressing. And then the bulk of your elevator pitch is going to focus on why is that problem or that question that you're addressing with your research important. So what makes it interesting? What is it relevant to in people's everyday lives? Or try to come up with some sort of hook to grab people's attention and to make them want to listen more about your research. And then finally, you want your elevator pitch to connect your research to the broader discipline and encourage further discussion with others in the field. So as far as some general tips for putting together an elevator pitch, I think, again, an elevator pitch is supposed to be short, so you want to keep it simple and to the point. You want to make sure that you're pitching it to the correct level. So in the case of a SACNAS conference, you're going to be talking to other science professionals, whether they're undergraduate students or graduate students, or maybe postdocs or professors. So you can aim your elevator pitch to be delivered at a slightly higher level than if you were, for example, talking to elementary schoolers. So you can use scientific terminology, but try not to get too specific in the jargon that's used in your field. A lot of people are going to be coming in from different disciplines, and so try to avoid the language that's overly technical, and define any acronyms or terms that you use that people may be unfamiliar with. Another thing that's really important in delivering a good elevator pitch is to practice it. So I often start by writing down my ideas for what I want to cover, and then rehearsing it several times, not necessarily reading it off a script or having it completely memorized, but practicing enough so that you hit the key points that you want to make, and it sounds natural and fluid. And then the last part is just to be enthusiastic, to make sure that you remember what it is that first interested you about your research, and to smile and deliver it enthusiastically. So those are some general tips for giving that elevator pitch. I think an elevator pitch comes in handy, particularly when you're giving a poster presentation. A poster presentation is going to be pretty short, usually only several minutes long. So you can use the elevator pitch to kind of guide you through your poster. You start with the main topic, and then you move from there into more specific results, and then summarize your findings at the end. But you can also use an elevator pitch if you're giving an oral presentation to kind of introduce your research at the beginning of your talk. So again, we have those tips for you there in that document. I encourage you all to work on your elevator pitch, not only for the SACNAS conference, but anytime you are in a scenario where you might want to talk about your research. So now I'm going to hand it off to Ariana to give us some more talks about science communication.
Awesome, thank you. And sorry that I missed most of that. As a nod to dealing with technical issues, we had a good example of that, how you just kind of have to try and bounce back from it. So a lot of the work that I do is really focused on working with scientists at all levels, and trying to help them figure out how to share their work. And so we have a tip sheet that we often like to use with kind of things to remember for scientists, and we have it kind of pared down into 3 main categories. The first one being to make it clear. So things like staying focused on what your message is, keeping it simple. So oftentimes, with the work that we do a lot of multifaceted things, and we're really excited to share all of those different things. And so it's really important to kind of figure out and sit down for yourself and think, what is the one thing that I want my audience to walk away with after they're done listening to my, talk at my poster or listening to my, research presentation? And so kind of thinking about like, what is that main thing? And then stepping back and thinking to yourself, what are the details that I need to give my audience so that they can understand this thing, can kind of help you get the parameters for the information that you need to share and help you kind of focus the talk that you're giving. Another really important thing, even if you're giving a scientific presentation, is to pay attention to the kind of the specialized language or the jargon that you use in different settings, whether you are, presenting in a space where you're going to have people from different scientific backgrounds who might be listening to your talk, just as a means of opening up that talk for everybody to be able to understand you, being mindful of when you're using a really specialized word for your field and thinking of how can I better use a word that's better able to kind of capture this, so that I can then introduce that kind of bigger word that I'm going to use later. So even, the example of me using the term jargon, right? I told you all that it was specialized language before I introduced the term jargon, even if a whole bunch of you know what jargon is. And so kind of, those are all things that can help you make sure that the presentation that you're giving is clear. And the more clear that presentation is, the better it's going to be able to stick in your audience, and also the better they're going to be able to engage with you about the information that you're sharing. And so, there was one question on here that was really worried about trying to be mindful of your audience engaging with you as you're talking, and kind of how can you check in with them in this sort of context of doing webinars or online presentations. And by making sure you're doing really good SciComm, that can help you not just in like a personal setting, but also with the shift to moving online. And then the second aspect of this is to kind of help make sure that your presentation is memorable in some way. So if we are sitting and listening to, especially in this, format, several talks in a row or multiple poster presentations in a row, it's really important to be sure that your talk is embedded with things that help it stick out and help it be memorable to your audience. And so sometimes that is telling a story in your talk. And there are different models of storytelling that you can use. I think this was a question that was asked as well. And so there's a book called Houston, We Have a Narrative that is all about kind of science storytelling for the purposes of science communication. And the author goes through kind of several models for how you can start to test those things out. And the one that I personally like the best is a play on a famous quote by an evolutionary biologist that says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution." And so you can kind of use that quote to get to the core of the information that you want to communicate. So if I am doing a talk on science communication, like I'm doing right now, I might phrase that conversation or use that model and say, nothing in science communication makes sense except in light of making sure you're speaking clearly. And so it's that speaking clearly nugget that really puts into context what you need to be doing with science communication. And you can do all sorts of different things to help make sure that your talk is memorable. Using things like analogies can help, that gives your audience some kind of reference point for how you're sharing and what you're sharing. You can do things that actually help your audience engage with you. So I did my PhD research on a tiny plant, and the plant lived in symbiosis with this bacteria that provided it with nitrogen. And so oftentimes when I would start that talk, I would have my audience close their eyes and take a big deep breath and use that as an introduction to share how most organisms on the planet can't actually use all the nitrogen that's available to us in the air. So we have to have these relationships to help us get nitrogen. And so you can do things, especially in this context, that help you get the audience involved in the things that you're saying. So those things can kind of help with that memorability. And then the last tip we like to give our scientists when we're talking about good SciComm, and then we can kind of open it up. So I see in the chat that somebody asked what the book title was. The book title is Houston, We Have a Narrative by Randy Olson. So Randy Olson used to be a marine biologist, and then he stepped away from that to become a documentary filmmaker, and he's solely focused on how do we tell scientific stories that need to be told. So the kind of last thing we tell our audience or our scientists when we're speaking SciComm is to make sure that what you're saying connects to your audience in some way. And so whether that is adding in personal touches of like your personal story of how you chose to engage in this science or how you came to science, or kind of answering this so what question for your audience, which is essentially answering the question of why do they care about this, right? Why should they sit or stand and listen to you speak about what you're speaking about? And so that can be a good framing point for you as you're thinking about your presentation as well. And kind of living in this virtual space, right? You're losing that kind of human connection oftentimes that we have when we are presenting. And so these kind of basic aspects of science communication, make it clear, make it memorable, make it connect, are even more important in this context than they are in your regular everyday kind of science talk context. So I think with that, I'll wrap up my portion, and then we can kind of, I guess, go answer more questions for folks.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you all. For all our attendees, I want to remind this is a great time to submit any questions you might have to the panel. We have first question. Do you have tips to stay focused during live presentations when there are distractions in the background, especially if you're in a busy home environment?
Yeah. I saw that question come up, and it definitely made me think of how my house is. So I do a lot of things to kind of prep for when I'm doing presentations and things like that. So one is I try and make sure that my phone is nowhere near me within reaching distance, so that in these kind of lull moments, right, I'm not like gravitating towards my phone and then totally out of touch with what's happening. I also have a dog in my house who likes to bark at things out the window. And so that can be distracting as well, not just for me, but if I'm, not on mute and I'm speaking, then it becomes a distraction for everybody in the audience. And so I'll do things like make sure the blinds are drawn if he's still in the room with me, which he is right now, luckily he's sleeping, or in a space where he's not going to come in and out, and I'll shut him out of that space for the duration of that talk. So it can be important to kind of just identify what those distractions are at first, and then try and figure out how you can problem solve with them in the that you have. But then also just kind of, having that compassion of because we're working from our homes, those distractions. And so it's okay if that happens.
Thank you, Ariana. Evan, you want to add? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was going to add, I don't know if you can hear, but there's a crying baby in the background of, of my presentation right now. But headphones for me helps, and having like a separate space, as Ariana said, where I can kind of be by myself. If I'm listening to a presentation, I think that taking notes while listening to that presentation helps me stay focused. So there's two aspects to staying focused, whether you're giving a presentation or being on the receiving end of one. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Another question I have for the panel: how do you make sure everyone is understanding without visual cues that you normally will have in person presentation?
I would say that if you're doing a live presentation, you can find ways to get the audience involved, either by perhaps doing a poll. So I think Zoom might have a polling functionality, or you can pose a question to the audience and have them type their responses in the chat, or you can have them raise their hand and reply via audio. So you can design activities like that maybe every few minutes within your live presentation to try to keep the audience engaged and make sure that they are understanding what you're saying, even though you can't necessarily see their faces.
We hear the baby now. Great question from our SACNAS Corey Village. Could each of you share a story of a time when you gave a less than ideal talk presentation? What mistakes did you make?
So go for it, Maria.
Oh, the question is less than ideal presentation?
Yes.
What did I do?
Maybe not such a successful presentation.
Yeah, probably one of my job talks when I was finishing up my PhD. I gave a presentation, and it was material I knew, but I felt like I didn't communicate the ideas as well as I had before, and that's really tough to recover from. So the time for me to do that recovery was during the Q&A part. So if in this virtual setting, if you have a Q&A part, that would be an appropriate time to recover. So that's probably one of the times. Another time, just really briefly, was I had to do a presentation on this applied math method, and I read the paper back and front, and I still didn't understand it. And so when I presented, that showed, and it was probably one of the worst presentations I'd ever done. And it wasn't in front of a lot of people. It was in front of maybe my class and the instructor. And it was very humbling. So there's been a few experiences like that where after an experience like that, you want to do better and you want to communicate your science better. So that's also how sometimes you recover, is you in the future you practice more.
Yeah, so for me, kind of two distinct instances came to mind. So when I was in undergrad, I was terrified of public speaking, which is ironic that I now work in science communication. And I was terrified of it. And we had to do presentations in almost every class that I took. And I was one of those speakers who, because I was nervous, I would speak really, really fast, and I would get fidgety. So if I had, a pen that was a clicky top, I would stand there and I would click it through the duration of the presentation. And so all of those things kind of combined made it really difficult to try and pay attention to what it was I was trying to say. And so as a of that, I put myself into situations that forced me to grow as a public speaker. And I learned how to kind of fuel my fidgeting in more purposeful ways. So you probably notice that I use hand gestures a pretty good amount when I'm speaking. And I try and now make sure that when I do make hand gestures, I am using them to try and emphasize whatever point I'm trying to make. So I kind of transformed that, mistake into something I could use. And to kind of, help with the talking too fast, several things like kind of finding a routine to go through before I get up and speak to kind of help combat those nerves. And if I am doing like a, PowerPoint presentation or something like that, injecting like slides that maybe they're blank, maybe they have 2 words on them, but they force me to kind of pause in those instances to combat that speaking too fast. And then I can another example where I was giving a presentation for 8th graders, and the things that didn't go well in those instances were trying to cover too much in that session. And when you do that, right, it takes away space for trying to really engage with those like younger people and figure out the things that they're interested in. But I think a lot of us end up being guilty of I want to share all this really cool stuff. And so you just try and like squeeze through it all super fast. And so now I kind of give myself permission to, okay, I might be covering less material, but I am covering it more intentionally. And so it's actually going to make a better impression on my audience.
Great, thank you, Ariana, for sharing that. Could you also share about tailoring your presentation to different audience, scientists and who are not scientists?
Sure, I can, start us off on this one. To me, a lot of the SciComm work that I do is focused on helping scientists figure out how to present to non-expert audiences, folks who are outside of their field, whether it's outreach with kids, or you just want to talk to your family about your research, or you're doing a presentation for for investors because you have a startup idea or something along those lines, people who are outside of your area of expertise. And the big thing that we encourage our scientists to do, oftentimes in that context, the assumption is, oh, now I have to dumb down my work so that these folks can understand it. And that's a really big misconception, because it's not that the people you're speaking to aren't smart, it's that they decided to dedicate their time to the same field that you did. And so the thing that we encourage scientists to do the most is figure out how to relate your science to their lives in some way. Because if you have that aspect of relatability, that means of showing them why what you have to say is important, then that gets them interested. And then those other things like, are good language that helps make it clear? Do you have an analogy that is more easy to understand than kind of the conceptual framework, so that you can provide them with that analogy so they can start to understand that framework? Those things kind of help you carry that as well, once you figure out kind of how does this relate to you? How is this important to you? And I think the same thing holds for when you're speaking to scientific audiences as well. But because they've had that scientific training, and they sometimes, right, are using that same vocabulary as you can provide more details. I like to use the analogy of like, it's just like as you're learning math in school, right? They don't throw calculus at you right out the gate. They build a foundation at first so that you can start manipulating using those components, and then they introduce the things that require more detail. And so as you're thinking about science communication and kind of making sure that your talk is tunable to different audiences, that same thing sort of applies.
Great, thank you. Evan, Mario, do you have anything to add? I have another question, and Mario, it would be probably more addressed towards you. Do you have any advice for math presentations?
Yeah, so now, by this point now, I've judged a few, and I've also had some of my students give math presentations. So I do applied math, so I always tell students to start off with the motivation of why should people care about this particular topic. But I've also judged some theoretical math, and there was one in particular where it was talking about quantifying the number of possibilities or moves you can make with a rook in a chess board. And so this led to some pretty beautiful mathematics, but the person started with a picture of a chessboard and described the problem. And for the rest of the presentation, I understood what the goal was. It was to enumerate the possible ways to get this piece in chess to another side of the board, right? So trying to find a specific picture that captures that idea is really beneficial.
Thank you. Next question is for you all. Is there anything you do in-person presentation that you should not do in an online presentation?
That's a really good question. I think not necessarily you shouldn't do, but it's harder to do is to tell jokes. Like I like telling cheesy jokes, especially like during my lectures in class, and it's harder to gauge if people are laughing at them when you're doing virtual jokes. So sometimes I'll still throw it in there, but it doesn't have the same effect, right? So I could definitely tell as soon as we went virtual, my jokes decreased. So then I just ended up including them in my YouTube videos for the lectures. And but yeah, that's something I don't know if you should include, but it definitely changes the dynamic.
One other thing that I've changed a little bit since I've started teaching online, at least, is in class, I used to prompt students for questions by asking, do you have any questions? And usually one or two students would raise their hand or come up with something after a short pause. But in an online environment, that's not usually how it works. Usually it's quiet, and I haven't gotten many responses just by saying, do you have any questions? I have to be a lot more intentional about prompting my students to engage in the class. So I'll usually, instead of asking, do you have any questions, I'll ask them a question and have them respond to gauge their understanding. So that's been something I've had to adjust a little bit since going online.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting adjustment, the shift to online. So for me, I'm a very mobile person when I am, whether it's giving, a talk or teaching my classes. Oftentimes I tend to get like very interactive with like my slides, or I'm writing things on the board. I'm, a very like up and mobile teacher, and that's obviously something that doesn't work in this context. If I am, up and moving around, I am going out of frame, and it's distracting and hard to pay attention to. So that's definitely one of them, is just being more cognizant of my movement on camera. And then the other thing is kind of figuring out where your eyes should go while you're presenting, because like you don't want to look at the camera, because then that looks really creepy. And so kind of figuring out like, how do I vary my eye contact if I am, using like gallery view and there are several faces or things along those lines. So being really mindful about those sorts of body movements and how they translate or don't translate online. Yeah.
Thank you. Any advice on how should you set up your background, choosing your body position in the camera?
I think we all have about the same body position, right? So I would say try to do that. Also, depending on who your audience is. If you're doing a presentation, right, you can focus on the research, right, and the science you're trying to communicate. But I don't know. For me, sometimes I will, if I'm doing a lecture, for example, and I want to boost morale, I will change my background to like Fresno State football field, and I'll pretend I'm a football announcer. So it really depends.
And I think lighting can be important. Try to find a well-lit room. And I think if it's too dark, it almost puts people to sleep. Having something in the background, I think, is important, just to have some sort of visual that they can look at other than the face.
Yeah. Lighting, what's on the walls behind you, and paying mind to the like contrast. So like for me, right, the wall behind me is beige, and if I was wearing a beige sweater instead of the blue one that I had on, I would blend into that background. And so kind of paying attention to those sorts of things can be helpful too. Also paying attention to like the angle of your webcam on your computer or whatever webcam you happen to be using is a thing to pay attention to as well. I have my laptop sitting on several books so that it is at a higher level so that you get this angle as opposed to it sitting right on the counter and it being at like a downward angle where I'm looking down on all of you, because that would be equally uncomfortable. So it's, if you're worried about any of those things in regards to how you're going to look on video chat or something like that, you can always hop on, test those things out for yourself. I do that just to kind of check it and make sure that, oh, did I notice that this thing's in frame that I don't want to be in frame, or something along those lines. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. What is the best software to use to present your research, such as PowerPoint, Google Slide, Prezi, etc.?
I don't know if the software itself necessarily matters as much as how you choose to use that software. You can put together a beautiful presentation on any of those things, or you can put together a presentation that is like really distracting or really wordy or things like that. And so I think it really depends on, like in choosing, say, Prezi versus a PowerPoint, it really depends on what it is you're trying to do with those slides and how you want your audience to engage with them. So I know Google Slides, for example, they have an add-on so that you can use Poll Everywhere Poll live within your presentation. And so if you want those capabilities, then you could use that format so that you can use them. So I think you just got to ask yourself the question of, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this? And then choose your platform based on that.
Great, thank you. Can you share a science communication win that you have had with your family or a family member, or COVID-19 scenario?
Well, I talk a lot about my work with my wife, Rebecca, and she's also a biochemist, but she's been out of the science game for a while. So I think when talking to her, I again try to use some of these points, like focusing on the broad or the most important topic, trying to make it relatable or memorable to her. So she's in medicine, so some of the research that I try to talk about, I try to relate back to medicine when I talk to her about it. So using some of these same ideas that we've discussed in this webinar, I think can be useful when you're talking to your family.
Yeah, definitely agreed. So I can remember when I started grad school, one of the first labs that I rotated through was a fruit fly lab, and it was studying pain reception in flies, that we could translate that research into kind of studying how human beings feel pain and ways that we can treat that. And the first time I told my grandpa what I was doing, he literally just laughed at me, like entirely and completely just like laughed at me over the dinner table. And so I kind of in the same vein was like, well, yes, we're using fruit flies and this seems silly, but here's the bigger point, and this is why we're doing it in this system first. And so it really did take some applying those, like one being like, okay, this person totally wasn't taking me seriously, even though it was a family member that like I loved, and like not being taken aback by that, to be like, no, actually there's a point to like why we're doing these things. So I think he still thinks it's funny, but I tried my best.
Thank you. Another question. How do you know which words are better for your presentation in order to be mindful with the audience?
Yeah, so excellent question. There are a couple of different tools that you can use online to check your language. One of them is called the dejargonizer, and essentially you can feed it like, you know, a paragraph of stuff, and it'll go through and kind of mark which ones are considered jargon or aren't commonly used by folks. And then there is another one that's kind of funny. It's made by the same person that makes the comic strip XKCD. I think that's the right order of letters. And it's called the Upgoer. Oh my goodness. I have to look it up now. This is one of the perks of, yeah, it's the Upgoer 5. So it's named after the Saturn V rocket. And so it does a similar thing where you feed it text and then it'll go through and highlight what words are like jargon. And it essentially tells you that like those aren't words and you have to find better ones. And it's called the Upgoer 5 because it's based on the Saturn V rocket. And, you know, it's based, the text editor itself is based on like the most common words in the English language, and like Saturn and rocket aren't in that dictionary. And so they can't call it the Saturn V, they have to use other things. And so rockets go up, and so that's why the text editor is called that. So those are two ways using those that you can try and check your words and figure out if they're gonna be roadblocks or not. Another way you can do that is talk to somebody who is either outside of your field or not an expert in the area that you're in, and you can ask them, right? You can give them your elevator pitch and then be like, what words created road bumps for you? And that can kind of help you gauge that as well. Any space where you say a word and like the person that you're speaking to is kind of like gives you that like fuzzy look of like, that kind of can be an indicator that maybe replacing that word or using another means of introducing it could be better.
Thank you for that. Do you think that incorporating a short video can help to connect to people in more interactive way? Mario, what is your opinion, your thinking?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is it in the context of a live presentation, or is it in the context of teaching? I do short videos.
Presentation, probably when you present your research, if it's useful to play a video.
I try to keep, if I'm doing a live presentation and I try to keep any videos maybe to like 30 seconds or less. That's, at the end of the day, they if it's really useful to illustrate a concept, like maybe it's like a GIF or something that's evolving in time and you can't really describe that really well with words, or it's just a picture, it doesn't do it justice, then maybe just playing a short video would be helpful. But in general, you want to also use your words and visualizations to communicate what your science is about.
Thank you. We have a question specifically addressed to Evan. When prompting students with questions to gauge their understanding of the subject, do you focus on group questions or more individual-based selection of a student to answer?
Yeah, I do. I usually do group questions posed to the entire class. I'm interested more so in in the general, I guess, knowledge of the room rather than just the knowledge of a specific person. So if I see that only 50% or less of the class has got that question right, then I know that's something that we need to address a little bit more. So I typically just do group questions rather than calling on an individual.
Thank you. Another good question we have, when using less jargon, do you worry that the experts in your field will take you less serious?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and it's one that we get constantly. And the answer is no, because if you are using less jargon as a means of ensuring that you have a dynamite presentation, nobody is going to complain at you for that, right? If the audience sitting in that room knows precisely what you were doing, why you were doing it, and finds it super interesting because you presented it in a super clear and memorable way, then there's nothing to kind of, have their nose turned up at you about, right? You're still doing serious science, regardless of if you are using the heaviest jargon imaginable to describe it, or if you were using much clearer and plainer language to describe it. And so the thing that you are doing is ensuring that your audience is absorbing that information. It doesn't take away from the science itself that you've done and that you're describing.
Thank you. What do you do if you have time for questions and nobody has any? How do you feel awkward silences?
You tell a joke.
I think it's also okay to just take a pause, embrace the silence. Usually if that goes on long enough, somebody will come up with a question.
Yeah, that's something I learned was in teaching specifically. If you pause long enough, people get uncomfortable and they will ask a question to break the silence.
Yeah, similarly, so one of my teaching mentors taught me the 8-second trick. So if you count to 8 seconds in your head slowly, in that time gap, somebody will ask a question, because 8 silence feels a lot longer than it actually is in that silence. I also, in classroom settings, right, have, in those instances where students haven't said anything, I'll be like, I'm happy to sit in silence as long as you would like to. And that little bit of I'm totally comfortable with the silence because they're not, somebody will kind of say something. Another thing that, sometimes you can do as well is also voice your own questions, right? Obviously in doing science, when you get to the end of your presentation, there are going to be questions, right? That's just the way that the world works. And so kind of being that man, for me in doing this work, here are some of the questions that I have about this. And that can kind of open the door to other people starting to, answer questions as well.
Thank you. If we're coming closer to an hour, the time passed way too fast. And I just wanted to mention that if you have any additional questions or would like to connect with one another after this webinar, we invite you to continue the discussion in our online student research presentations community. Follow the link on the screen or in the chat window and sign into your SACNAS membership to get started. Lastly, we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. In the next few minutes, you will receive an email with the survey. I encourage you to provide feedback on today's program and give us suggestions for future topics, how we can assess you better. This concludes our Effective Online Presentations webinar. Thank you to all the speakers for taking the time to support our students, and to all attendees for your engagement and insightful discussion, for your all wonderful questions. Have a good day, everyone. And yeah, thank you so much.